Yeah, all through my life, people would confide in me about their feelings about First Nations people, and I hid it. I didn't know how to deal with it. I wasn't equipped to handle that. I am more so now. But as a child, I wasn't able to handle that. And the way it manifests in my behavior was that I realized quite young, because there was nothing written about First Nations people in the newspapers. The only thing you knew about Indians was what you saw in the movies or on television, right? So that was our only insight into Aboriginal people, except for like the First Nations kids that came in from Wisconsin First Nations to the school. And like at that time in the 60s, right, children were streamed right into, so all the Aboriginal kids were streamed into shops. They weren't allowed to, they really weren't encouraged to develop like, into like academics, right? What we, to go on to university. The best they could ever hope for was like to, become a plumber or something. I saw that, I recognized that quite young. And it got to the point where we had student-teacher meetings. I didn't want my mom going. I thought that, by having my father come, everyone would know that I was a white guy, and I wouldn't get streamed, right, into, like, I didn't want to be a plumber. I wanted to go to university.
In terms of systemic racism in Canada, it's my opinion that the settler colonial system relies on the dehumanization of Indigenous people. The way that works is that in order for settler colonialism as a system, and that's the system we live in Canada, to exist, you have to kind of systematically erase Indigenous people. Now, they've tried to do that physically, but the other way that they've also tried to do that is to take away our humanity. So we've been sort of systematically prevented from telling our own stories and talking about our ways and how we do things. And oftentimes those stories have been either appropriated or told by someone who's not Indigenous. In terms of the dehumanization of Indigenous people, that works on a variety of levels in Canadian society. So when you prevent people from being able to tell their own stories, you can then inject whatever narrative it is that you want, and people will believe it because they're not hearing any kind of other counter-narrative. In Canada, that narrative has been that Indigenous people are wards of the state, that we receive handouts from the government, that we are like, all of the bad stereotypes. We are alcoholics. We are more prone to violence. These things are not statistically true, and it also relies on a kind of erasure of the colonial legacy of Canada. So what's happening is you're believing these things, but never considering, well, what are the reasons for that? Why is there a higher representation of Aboriginal people in the homeless population of Toronto? Why? Well, we can think about residential schools. We can think about the 60s scoop. We can think about land dispossession. We can think about the number of people who've been disenfranchised from their communities for a variety of reasons. Those are things that kind of narrative is not often told in the media. I personally think that trajectory is sort of changing. I think the more time goes on, the more power Indigenous people have to tell their own stories. The more media we have of our own, the more higher profile people speaking about these things and telling the truth, the more change happens. But for a very long time, we weren't allowed to tell our stories. The acclaimed author Lee Maracle tells a story about the first book she ever published. Now, this is a woman who was one of the first Aboriginal people to ever be published in Canada, one of the first Aboriginal people to ever go to university. She's a great seminal author she won the Premier's Award in 2014. She tells a story about when she went to publish her first book. She brought it to a publisher. They looked at it. They said, "This is fantastic, but we're not going to publish it." And she said, "Why is that?" And they said, "Because Indians don't read." So she actually had to go out and get she tells the story. She had to go out and get signatories, like people to sign a petition, and she got 800 people to sign a petition saying they would buy the book if it was published.
They would say, all you people. And then I have to kind of, interject on that and say, like, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by all you people. And I think that they just don't know. And some of them feel embarrassed about it because they just don't know how to approach it. Huh? So I kind of help them bridge that. You all people live on the reserves, and that yes, the negative side would be you're a bunch of boozers, all that. You take off as soon as you get your paycheck. Mind you, that happened when I worked first at the hospital. They're not open today. They got paid. They must be all on a big party. Yeah. We laughed. We laughed when we heard that. Yeah. We didn't take a defense to it, but we came back to it as how to readdress that and make it in a positive educational approach. That's what we did. Okay. Stereotypes are damaging. They hurt people. Okay? They put labels on you big time.
I was recently at a gathering and residential school came up. I don't know how it came up, but we were all in some sort of an outing. And I told the person, I went to residential school because we were, I guess, sharing our education. And she goes, oh, she says, is that like boarding school? And I said, no, it's not like boarding school. And she goes, oh, what's residential school then if it's not like boarding school? I'm doing this, I'm trying to do a waspy accent. And I said, oh, it's, at that, it wasn't the place to explain, right? So I just said, oh, go home and Google it or look it up on the internet, residential school system with Aboriginal people. So she said, okay. But and she was Canadian. She was born in Canada. She's been here all her life. Yet she doesn't know what the residential school is. That's what's amazing.